I have a photo of the exact moment my life shattered. It was taken by a Hamilton County deputy's body camera at 9:14 a.m. on Christmas Eve, snow clotting the pine needles behind the lodge, and the timestamp shows me standing in wool socks on the front porch, staring at a white court order nailed to my front door, while my stepmother Patricia clutched a red leather folder and told me to pack my things in the next 20 minutes. I have looked at that frame 100 times, and each time I feel the cold of that morning, the crunch of Curtis dragging my tool chest across the gravel, and the particular sound of my mother's cedar jewelry box hitting the floorboards inside and cracking open, as though the house itself was spitting out a secret. 2 years later, I own every square inch of that lodge. The deed sits in a fireproof safe in my bedroom, and every summer solstice I walk to a granite fire pit behind the main cabin and burn their wedding photos one by one while a dozen women writers watch. But that ending started from a single hinged box and 3 sentences written in shaky cursive by a woman who had been dead for 4 years. My name is Lena Marchetti. I am 42 years old, and for 20 years, I have made my living as a Finnish carpenter specializing in historic Adirondack camp restoration. The kind of work where you match hand-hewn mortise and tenon joints without a nail gun, and you can identify the age of a floorboard by the width of the saw curve. My mother Elaine was a 3rd-grade teacher who taught in the same Utica public school for 31 years and who clipped grocery coupons so aggressively that the cashiers knew her by name. When she was diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer, she sat me down in her tiny kitchen with the yellow Formica table and told me she was leaving me $140,000, every cent she had managed to salt away in a series of credit union CDs and a modest IRA. She handed me a deposit slip and a short note in her handwriting that read, "Build something that will last, something no one can take from you." I didn't know that the something would be a crumbling lakeside lodge and that the no one would be a woman she had never met. The lodge belonged to my father, Dominic, a man who loved quiet mornings and hated confrontation so deeply that he would agree to anything just to end a conversation. He owned 7 acres on the eastern shore of Mirror Lake, a spring-fed body of water so clear you could count pebbles in 20 feet of depth. The property included a main lodge built in 1932 with a massive fieldstone fireplace, 3 guest cabins that had been sinking into the pine duff for a decade, and a boathouse that leaned so hard to port you could skip stones from the doorframe. He was drowning not in nostalgia, but in $18,000 of back property taxes, a roof that leaked in 7 places, and a septic system that had failed 3 state inspections, which meant he couldn't legally occupy the place without risking a condemnation order. I saw a hard road and a fair trade. I drew up a written agreement with a real estate attorney in Inlet, a document that specified every detail. I would fund the entire renovation from my mother's inheritance, would personally perform or manage all construction labor, and would cover all material costs, taxes, and insurance during the work period. In exchange, upon completion of the renovation to a habitable standard as verified by a county code inspection, Dominic would execute a deed transferring to me a 50% ownership interest in the entire parcel as tenants in common with right of survivorship, meaning if he died, his half would automatically pass to me and not to any future spouse. We signed the agreement on a Tuesday in March, had it notarized by the town clerk in Inlet, and I filed a memorandum of contract with the Hamilton County Clerk's office so that it would cloud the title and appear in any future title search. I thought I had built an unbreakable legal fortress. For 2 years, I rebuilt that lodge from the foundation up. I hired a local excavator to dig out and replace the entire septic leach field with a modern pressurized mound system that cost $27,000. I jacked the main lodge off its crumbling stone piers with 4 20-ton hydraulic jacks, 1 corner at a time, and poured new reinforced concrete footers that went 48 inches below the frost line. I pulled the old knob end tube wiring out by hand and ran new Romex through every wall, installing a 200-amp service panel with arc fault breakers because I wanted the place to be safer than code required. I resawed salvaged hemlock beams on a portable bandsaw to replace 16 rotted rafters in the main roof, and I spent a full month on my knees, hand-scraping the original pumpkin pine flooring with a carbide pull scraper until the wood glowed like dark honey in the afternoon light. By October of the second year, the lodge had new triple-pane argon-filled windows, a rebuilt fieldstone fireplace with a new stainless steel chimney liner, a kitchen with soapstone counters I had cut and polished myself, and 3 guest cabins with new cedar shake siding and fresh enameled plumbing fixtures. The boathouse I had stabilized with helical piles and converted into a workshop. I had 3 reservations on the books for a spring fishing group, a women's hiking club, and a family reunion, all with deposits paid. The property, once worth maybe $180,000 in its derelict state, now appraised at $520,000 based on comparable lakefront sales in Hamilton County. My father seemed proud of the place, walking the new dock in his worn loafers and saying it looked just the way his own grandfather would have wanted it. And then he met Patricia at a senior singles mixer at the Lake Placid Convention Center, and the entire geometry of my life shifted. The discovery happened brutally fast. On December 20th, my father called me from the lodge and said he and Patricia were taking a 10-day Christmas cruise to the Bahamas, that he needed to clear his head and think about how the property would work now that he was getting remarried. I felt a cold needle of alarm, but I said okay, we'd talk when he got back. 2 days later, on December 22nd, I drove up from my small apartment in Old Forge to the lodge to check on the pipes with the winter cold settling in. The place was dark and locked tight, and I noticed a U-Haul truck parked behind the boathouse with the keys in the ignition, empty. I didn't connect it. I stayed the night, lit a fire, and fell asleep in the loft bedroom I had built myself. On Christmas Eve morning, I was in the kitchen brewing a pot of coffee in my French press when I heard the distinct sound of a hammer striking wood. I walked to the front door in wool socks, opened it, and found 2 Hamilton County Sheriff's deputies on the porch. Deputy Morrison, a man I vaguely recognized from the hardware store, was tacking a white legal notice to the cedar clapboard I had personally installed. The header read, "Order to vacate and rid of possession." I stared at the words while the cold air cut through my flannel shirt. Behind the deputies, standing in the snow in a red wool coat that looked expensive and entirely inappropriate for a lakeside winter, was Patricia. She was holding a crisp manila folder. Behind her, a doughy 30-year-old man with a patchy goatee and a vape pen around his neck was pulling my tool chests out of the boathouse and loading them into the U-Haul. That was Curtis, her son from a previous marriage, a man who managed a vape shop in Rome that had been cited twice for selling counterfeit pods to high school kids. Patricia informed me that she was the new legal owner of the entire property. She claimed my father had executed a quitclaim deed 2 weeks prior, transferring the land and all improvements to her, solely, as her separate property, in consideration of their upcoming marriage. She held up a photocopy of the deed, and I could see the signature block with my father's name in blue ink, notarized by someone named Dolores Kettle in Oneida County. The date was December 10th. I told her that was impossible, that I had a notarized contract and a memorandum of contract on file. Patricia smiled in a way that showed her lower teeth and said, "That little agreement is between you and Dominic, but the deed is between Dominic and me, and the deed trumps everything in this state. Read the law." The deputies, looking miserable and cold, told me they were just there to enforce the court order, that a judge had signed it based on the quitclaim deed, and that I had 20 minutes to collect personal items before they changed the locks. They said if I removed any building materials, tools that were now considered fixtures, or anything that belonged to the property, I would be charged with theft. I stood there in the doorway, feeling the heat from the fireplace at my back and the December air on my face, and I knew I was being evicted from a house I had literally rebuilt with my own hands. I moved through the next 20 minutes in a state of numb autopilot. I went inside, Curtis trailing me like a jailer, and I grabbed my laptop bag, a duffel of clothes, my mother's old recipe box, and the small cedar jewelry box she had given me when I was 16. The box had brass hinges and a faded green velvet interior, and it held the few pieces of costume jewelry of hers I had kept, a silver locket without a chain, a cloisonné pin from a museum gift shop. As I was pulling it from the top shelf of the closet, Curtis snatched my cordless drill out of my hand, the one I had been using to fix a loose shelf bracket, and his elbow knocked the box from my grip. It hit the pine floor with a sharp crack, and the bottom of the box split along a grain line I had never noticed. A scatter of earrings and the broken halves of a cloisonné pin skittered across the boards. Curtis looked down at the mess and said, "Sentimental junk. Not worth a dime." He kicked the broken box to the side with his boot and grabbed my impact driver off the dresser. I knelt, shoving the scattered items into my bag as fast as I could while he was distracted with the tools, and I felt something shift inside the box's bottom. A thin sheet of cedar veneer had separated, revealing a hidden compartment maybe a quarter-inch deep that I had never known existed in 26 years of owning that box. I pressed the veneer back into place with my thumb and zipped my bag shut. Outside, the temperature had dropped to about 10 degrees. I sat on the tailgate of my pickup truck, a 20-year-old Ford F-250 I had rebuilt the engine on, and I pulled out the jewelry box. My hands were shaking from cold and adrenaline. I pried up the splintered veneer carefully, and inside the hidden compartment I found a yellowed envelope sealed with a lick of wax that had gone brittle with age. My name was written on the front in my mother's cursive. I opened it and pulled out a single sheet of stationery from the school where she had taught. The handwriting was shaky, the letter forms slightly irregular, probably from the neuropathy the chemo caused, but it was unmistakably hers. "Lena, if you ever find yourself pushed out of a place you love by someone who married into this family, know that I saw the weakness in your father long before you did. He will let others take what he promised you if he thinks it will buy him peace. Do not trust his new attachments. Save yourself." Beneath the text, she had drawn a small arrow pointing to a second thing in the envelope, a photocopy of a 1982 survey map of the lake parcel, with a note in the margin in her neatest script. It said, "Chain of title is everything." I sat there on the cold metal tailgate, snow beginning to dust my hair, and I realized with a sickening, vertiginous clarity that my mother had predicted this exact catastrophe years before she died, that she had left me this warning knowing I wouldn't find it until I needed it most. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe family isn't always blood. Within 4 hours, I had used nearly the last of my available cash to rent a room at a motel in Speculator that smelled of damp carpet and fried onions. The room had a television bolted to the wall, a bed with a comforter that had cigarette burns, and a window that looked out onto a closed snowmobile rental shop. That night, I barely slept. I replayed the eviction over and over, and each time I felt the crack of the jewelry box hitting the floor like a heart valve snapping shut. On Christmas Day, my phone rang at 8 in the morning. It was Patricia. Her voice was syrupy, dripping with theatrical concern. She said she felt just terrible about the misunderstanding, that Curtis had been overzealous, and that she wanted to help me get back on my feet. She offered to let me stay in the extra guest room at her house in Old Forge, just until I found my bearings. She said I shouldn't be alone during the holidays, that no matter what had happened we were still family, and that she and Curtis were both worried about me. I knew, even with sleep deprivation dulling my instincts, that this was a trap. She wanted to keep me close, to monitor me, to make sure I didn't hire a lawyer or start poking into the deed. But I also had nowhere else to go, and more importantly, I realized that if I stayed close, I might find the proof of what had been done to me. So I decided to play a role I had never played before, the broken, fragile woman who was no threat to anyone. I put on a performance that would have earned me an Oscar. I arrived at Patricia's split-level ranch house on the edge of Old Forge with trembling hands, a hollow stare, and a duffel bag that I clutched like a life preserver. I told her I was having memory gaps, that I couldn't remember details, that I felt foggy and disoriented from the shock. I said I just needed a few days to rest before I could even think about anything legal. Patricia and Curtis exchanged quick, loaded glances, the kind that telegraph, "We can push this one around." Patricia patted my arm and said, "Of course, sweetheart, you just rest." That evening, after a dinner of deli turkey and chips that Curtis ate with his mouth open, Patricia handed me a 2-page document printed on her home inkjet printer, a mutual release and waiver that stated, in dense legal language, that I would forever relinquish any ownership claim, contractual interest, or equitable right regarding the Mirror Lake Lodge property in exchange for $20,000, payable in 20 equal annual installments of $1,000 with no interest. She told me to sign it, for my own peace of mind, and that the first payment would be deposited into my bank account within 2 weeks. I read the document while pretending my vision was blurry, noting that the waiver also contained a clause stating I admitted the quitclaim deed was valid and that I had been fully compensated for my renovation work, which was a lie so massive I could feel it pressing against my teeth. I rubbed my temples and said I needed to read it when my head was clearer, maybe tomorrow. Patricia's smile tightened, but she folded the papers and said, "Of course, tomorrow." The next day I was moved into the guest room at the end of the hall, a small room with a single window that overlooked the neighbor's chain-link fence and a door that had a lock only on the outside, a hook and eye mechanism installed with the eye on the hallway side. I noticed things immediately. The kitchen island was permanently cluttered with credit card statements from 3 different issuers, all showing balances between $12,000 and $22,000. On my second morning, I heard Patricia on the phone in the den, her voice rising and falling in a rhythm of panic, saying something about the minimum payment balloon and the promo rate expired. I had taken enough community college accounting classes to know she was talking about credit card debt that was about to explode with compound interest. Later that day, I was folding laundry in the hallway when I heard Curtis on his own phone, arguing with someone about a debt he owed to a bookie, saying he would have the money as soon as the house stuff goes through. Then, on December 30th, a repossession truck pulled into the driveway and hauled away Curtis's BMW 3 Series, a car that still had temporary plates because he hadn't owned it long enough to get permanent ones. He stood in the driveway screaming at the driver while Patricia ran out and tried to block the truck with her body, but the driver just rolled the car onto the flatbed and left. That night, at dinner, Patricia said she had a little cash flow issue and asked me if I could lend her $5,000. I said I had nothing left after the renovation, which was true, and she dropped the subject. But I started keeping a small spiral notebook in my pocket, and I wrote down every suspicious phrase, every financial term I overheard, every piece of paper I saw in the recycling bin. I knew I was collecting ammunition, but I didn't yet know how to fire it. The real breakthrough came in mid-January, through a household accident that was so mundane it felt like a gift from the universe. Patricia was trying to shove a whole lemon rind and a handful of coffee grounds down the garbage disposal, a disposal that had been making a grinding noise for weeks because the blades were shot and the flywheel was loose. It seized completely with a sound like a bearing shattering, and the sink backed up with foul gray water that slopped onto the laminate countertop and dripped onto the floor. Patricia shrieked and stepped back, and Curtis came over with a wooden spoon and started poking at the rubber splash guard as if he were trying to kill a spider. They both stood there, utterly helpless, arguing about who would call a plumber on a Saturday and pay the emergency rate. I walked into the kitchen, looked at the mess, and said I could probably fix it. I had done plenty of disposal replacements at the lodge. Patricia stared at me with a strange expression, a mix of suspicion and grudging admiration, and said, "Fine, but don't break anything else." I went down to the basement, found the breaker panel, and shut off the circuit to the disposal. I didn't just have carpentry experience. I had spent 2 years before my carpentry career working as an apprentice for a commercial locksmith in Syracuse, a man named Earl who had taught me how to rekey pin tumbler locks, how to decode wafer locks with a tension wrench, and how to read the wear patterns on old keys to cut new ones. That experience had given me a mechanical intuition that crossed over into every kind of hardware. I disconnected the disposal's electrical connection with a wire nut, loosened the mounting ring with a hex key I found in the junk drawer, and pulled the whole unit out from under the sink. The impeller plate was cracked, and the grind ring was clogged with a hardened amalgam of lemon rind, coffee grounds, and what appeared to be a fragment of a pen cap. I cleaned the entire trap under the sink, removing a disgusting wad of steel wool some previous owner had inexplicably stuffed into the pipe, reassembled the old drain connections, and capped the disposal drain temporarily until a new unit could be installed. I turned the water on, and it ran clear and silent. Patricia watched the clear water disappear down the drain, and her expression shifted. It wasn't gratitude. It was the uncomfortable realization that I possessed a deep, practical competence that she and Curtis could never fake, and that kind of competence is dangerous when you are trying to control someone. That night, after Patricia and Curtis had gone to bed and the house had settled into the low-frequency hum of the furnace, I made my first move. I had noticed that the den at the end of the hallway had been converted into Patricia's home office, and in the corner there was a 2-drawer metal filing cabinet with a small key lock, the kind of cheap wafer lock that a motivated child with a paperclip could bypass in 30 seconds. During my locksmith years, I had rekeyed hundreds of similar cabinets in medical offices and law firms. I didn't have my picks because Patricia had made me leave my entire tool collection at the lodge, and I couldn't risk retrieving anything. But I did have a bobby pin from my toiletry kit and a small metal nail file. I waited until the clock read 1:30 in the morning, when the house was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator compressor cycling in the kitchen. I crept down the hall in my sock feet, testing each floorboard for creaks, and knelt in front of the filing cabinet. I straightened the end of the bobby pin into a simple tension wrench by bending a tiny L-shaped hook, and I used the rounded tip of the nail file as a rake pick. The lock was a single-sided wafer design, typically with 5 wafers, and I could feel the light spring tension as I inserted the pick and began to rake back and forth gently, applying a slight rotational pressure with the tension wrench. I heard each wafer click as it set, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the plug turned with a soft snick. I froze and listened for footsteps. Nothing. I opened the top drawer. Inside, the files were organized with a pathological neatness, colored tabs and plastic dividers, the kind of obsessive filing system someone builds when they are hiding something. The first folder I pulled was labeled Mirror Lake Title. It contained the original quitclaim deed, not a photocopy, the actual document with the blue ink signatures and the notary stamp. I placed it on the desk under a small gooseneck lamp and examined it with a jeweler's loupe I kept in my bag for inspecting antique hardware. The notary stamp was from Dolores Kettle, commission number NY0748392, with an expiration date that, according to the stamp, ran through 2027. But I knew from my mother's note about chain of title that notary stamps are public record. I made a note of the commission number. Later, I would search the New York Department of State's notary public database and find that Dolores Kettle had died of a stroke on March 4th, 6 months before the date on the deed. A dead woman cannot notarize anything. The signature of my father was the real tell. I pulled out another folder from the cabinet, a folder labeled Dominic Personal, and found an old canceled check from his bank account when he had signed to pay a utility bill. I laid the check next to the deed. Under magnification, I could see that the signature on the deed was an almost exact tracing of the check signature, line for line, but the pen pressure was uniform and stiff, lacking the natural variation of a live hand. There were slight tremors at the end points, the kind of telltale mark left by someone carefully copying a signature rather than writing it fluidly. I photographed both documents with my phone, holding my breath every time the furnace kicked on and rattled the ductwork. The second folder was the real bomb. It was labeled Adirondack Trust Loan Origination. Inside was a mortgage application packet for a cash-out refinance loan, $310,000, secured against the Mirror Lake property with a 30-year fixed rate. The borrower was listed as Patricia Halsey, and the co-borrower was listed as Lena Marchetti, me. My forged signature appeared on the application, the promissory note, and the truth in lending disclosure. I stared at it, my own name signed in neat block letters that looked nothing like my actual flowing cursive. A signature a child could have faked, and yet an underwriter at Adirondack Trust had apparently accepted it without the usual independent verification, because Patricia had presented my social security number, which she must have obtained from my father. The loan was set to close on February 3rd, and the funds were already tentatively scheduled for disbursement. The monthly payment was going to be $2,460, an impossible sum for someone with no income, and the loan documents indicated that the property's appraised value had been inflated to $600,000 based on a fraudulent appraisal that ignored my ownership interest entirely. Then I found the file labeled Fall Plan, and the breath in my lungs turned solid. It was a memo typed in a plain font, addressed from Patricia to Curtis, dated December 26th, just 2 days after the eviction. It outlined, step by step, what they intended to do once the cash-out refinance funded. Step 1. Use $60,000 to pay off Patricia's credit card debt and Curtis's gambling debts. Step 2. Move the remaining $250,000 into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands through a shell company called Mirror Holdings LLC, which Patricia had already registered. Step 3. Direct the mortgage lender to collect the monthly payments from co-borrower Lena Marchetti by garnishing her wages if necessary, because she had apparent assets and they had none. Step 4. Let the loan go into strategic default within 12 months, allowing the bank to foreclose, at which point Lena Marchetti would be solely responsible for the full deficiency balance because Patricia and Curtis would have no attachable assets and would be judgment-proof. The final line read, "By the time she realizes what happened, we will be in Belize." I sat on the floor of that den, the hum of the furnace filling my ears, and I realized I wasn't just being robbed of a house. I was being set up as the financial scapegoat for a $310,000 fraud that would follow me for the rest of my life. I photographed every page of every file, replaced everything in its exact original position, and relocked the cabinet by turning the plug back to its locked position with the tension wrench. I went back to the guest room and sat on the edge of the bed until the morning light grayed the window. I knew I needed an ally with access to the system that Patricia was trying to exploit. 2 days later, I took a calculated risk. I drove my truck to the nearest branch of Adirondack Trust, a low brick building on Genesee Street in Utica, and I walked in and asked the receptionist if I could speak with someone in mortgage fraud compliance. I was directed to a small office where a woman named Alyssa Nunes sat behind a desk with 2 monitors and a stack of regulatory binders. She was in her early 50s, with short gray hair and the calm, unhurried manner of someone who had spent 3 decades reconciling ledger sheets and auditing loan files. I told her my name, and she went still. She said, "That's interesting, because I have a loan file flagged on my desk with that exact name as a co-borrower, and a notary stamp that our automated system flagged as belonging to a deceased individual." I felt a surge of hope so intense it made my eyes water. I told her my story, and then I handed her my phone and scrolled through the photographs I had taken. She looked at the dead notary stamp, the forged signature comparison, the fall plan memo, and the loan application with my forged name. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she looked up at me and said, "The bank has an internal fraud alert on this file, but we need the original physical quitclaim deed to conduct a forensic handwriting analysis and to give the FBI sufficient evidence to open a case. If you can get me that original deed, I can coordinate with our legal department and the U.S. Attorney's Office. This crosses state lines because of the shell company registration documents I see here, which puts it squarely under federal wire fraud statutes. We met at a diner off the North-South Arterial, a place with red vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like it had been on the burner since the Nixon administration. I handed her the original quitclaim deed, which I had extracted from the filing cabinet 2 days earlier while Patricia was at a hair appointment. I had replaced it with a high-quality color copy I printed at the library, carefully creased and worn to look original. Alyssa sealed the deed in an evidence bag, and she told me that the bank would put a freeze on the loan disbursement immediately and would coordinate with the FBI's field office in Albany to schedule a controlled closing, a sting where I would show up at the bank with Patricia and Curtis, pretending to sign the final documents, while agents waited in an adjacent room. She said I would need to delay signing anything until she gave me a signal, and that the signal would be the door opening and the agents entering. I agreed. Before that confrontation, I knew I needed to test the depth of Patricia's cruelty, to burn away any remaining flicker of family loyalty that might cause me to hesitate. I had been nursing a fictional medical narrative for a week, telling Patricia and Curtis that I had been having dizzy spells and shortness of breath at night, and that a doctor at the urgent care clinic had heard an irregular heartbeat and wanted me to come in for a stress test, but I didn't have insurance and couldn't afford it. They listened with the distant politeness of people who don't actually care. On a Friday afternoon, with Patricia working in the den and Curtis parked on the couch watching a video on his phone, I stood in the hallway outside the den door and allowed myself to collapse. I didn't just slump. I dropped my full body weight against the wall with a heavy thud, my shoulder hitting the drywall, and then I slid down to the carpet, clutching my chest and gasping for air. I made my breathing wheezy and irregular, my eyes fluttering, and I let out a small, pained moan. Patricia looked up from her laptop. She saw me on the floor, halfway blocking the doorway to the den, and she didn't call out. She didn't stand up with alarm. She simply closed her laptop, stood, and walked toward the doorway. I saw her shoes, sensible beige flats, step past my head and then over my outstretched arm without pause. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't call 911. She didn't even speak to me. She continued into the hallway, walked to the filing cabinet I had relocked earlier, unlocked it with the key on her keychain, pulled out a file I recognized as the loan closing packet, and hurried toward the kitchen with it, muttering about needing to review the final numbers before Monday. Curtis, from the couch, looked up from his phone and said, through a mouthful of tortilla chips, "Is she gonna die or something?" Patricia's voice floated back from the kitchen, calm and flat. "Not yet. I need her signature on the closing docs." I lay on the carpet, my cheek pressed against the synthetic fibers, and in that moment I felt something inside me click into place like a well-machined lock cylinder. I had no family left in that house. I had only adversaries. The confrontation took place on Monday, February 5th, at the Adirondack Trust branch in Utica. Patricia drove her car, a black Chevrolet Impala that smelled of air freshener and stale cigarette smoke, with Curtis in the back seat and me in the passenger seat. She was dressed in a navy blazer, her hair sprayed into a rigid helmet, and she kept repeating the instructions to me as if I were a child. "You just sign where the little flags are, honey. Nothing to worry about. We'll all have a nice lunch after." Curtis was humming a tuneless melody and tapping his fingers on the window. I nodded, keeping my face slack and confused, the role I had perfected. We walked into the bank, past the faux marble counters and the tellers who didn't know what was about to happen, and into a glass-walled conference room where a young loan officer with too much gel in his hair and a desperate, fake smile sat with a stack of documents. He pointed to the signature flags, small yellow sticky arrows stuck to the signature lines on the promissory note, the mortgage, and the truth in lending statement. "Just sign and date here, and here," he said, "and the funds will disperse within 48 hours. I could see Patricia's hand twitching, Curtis's eyes flicking to the door as if he couldn't wait to leave. I picked up the pen, a cheap ballpoint with a bank logo. I held it for a long moment, long enough for Patricia's expression to shift from impatience to sharp, brittle anger. Then I placed the pen down on the table with a quiet click and looked directly at her. I said, in a voice that came from somewhere deep and steady, "I'm not signing anything that isn't mine." Patricia opened her mouth to say something sharp, but before a sound could come out, the conference room door opened behind her. Alyssa Nunes walked in, followed by two agents in blue windbreakers with FBI insignia on the chest, and the bank's own private security director. One of the agents, a man with a calm, hard voice, placed his hand on Patricia's shoulder and said, "Patricia Halsey, you are under arrest for felony bank fraud, wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and conspiracy to commit grand larceny." He began to recite her Miranda rights while she stared at him with a face of absolute shock, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. Curtis stood up, knocking over his chair, and tried to bolt for the door, but the bank's security director was blocking it with his body. Within 90 seconds, both of them were in handcuffs. Patricia screamed about her rights and demanded a lawyer, her voice so shrill the tellers behind the counter stopped moving. Curtis was sobbing, his face red and wet, saying, "It was all her idea, it was all her." The loan officer stood frozen, his pen still in his hand, his career not likely to survive the underwriting scandal that would follow. I sat in the chair, my hands folded on the table, and I watched the agents lead them out to the parking lot where a government SUV was waiting. The aftermath unfolded in stages, like the slow, methodical demolition of a fraudulent house. The FBI's forensic document examiner confirmed that the quitclaim deed was a complete forgery, traced from a genuine check, notarized with the stamp of a dead woman. The deed was declared void ab initio by the Hamilton County Supreme Court in a summary judgment proceeding, meaning it had no legal effect from the moment it was created. The bank voided the $310,000 mortgage and pursued a civil fraud judgment against Patricia. In the criminal case, she eventually pleaded guilty to 2 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of aggravated identity theft. The sentencing judge, a woman with a reputation for harshness in fraud cases, gave her 57 months in federal prison at the Danbury facility, the maximum within the guidelines. Curtis took a plea deal for conspiracy and received 30 months suspended with 5 years of supervised probation. But 7 months later, he violated that probation by leaving the state without permission and trying to sell counterfeit merchandise at a fair in Pennsylvania. And he ended up serving 18 months in a county jail that was, by all accounts, profoundly unpleasant. My father returned from his cruise on December 30th, tanned and confused, to find his wife under federal investigation and his daughter standing in a motel room with a file folder of evidence that could have sent him to prison as well if he had knowingly participated. He didn't know. He sat on the edge of my motel bed, the cigarette-burned comforter bunched under him, and cried. He told me that Patricia had pressured him constantly, that she had asked him to sign some simple paperwork to protect herself if anything happened to him, and that he had signed a blank form because he was afraid to argue with her. He said he never intended to give her the lodge, that he thought he was just adding her name to a bank account. I believed him because my father's weakness was never malice. It was a profound passivity that let other people's cruelty fill the void. But I also told him calmly that fear is not an excuse when your silence weaponizes the people who love you. He nodded, his shoulders slumping. Within a month, he filed for divorce, and in the marital settlement, he was awarded full ownership of the old forge house and sought to reclaim his interest in the lodge. But by then, I had already filed a quiet title action in Hamilton County Supreme Court. Quiet title is a legal mechanism designed to clear clouds on a property's ownership history, to resolve conflicting claims and establish clean, marketable title. My petition asked the court to declare that the forged quitclaim deed was void, that my earlier notarized contract and memorandum of contract created a valid equitable interest, and that the 50% tenancy in common deed that my father had finally executed, albeit late, was valid and senior to any other claim. The court agreed, and the judgment cleaned the title of Patricia's forgery entirely. But Patricia, from her prison cell, tried one final gambit. She argued through a court-appointed attorney that the lodge should be considered marital property because my father had owned it during their brief marriage, and she claimed she was owed half of his 50% share under equitable distribution laws. The judge, unimpressed, scheduled a hearing. To extinguish any lingering claim forever, I instructed my attorney to make an offer. I would buy Patricia's entire interest, whatever theoretical sliver she might fabricate, for exactly $1. The alternative, I made clear, was that I would pursue a civil restitution judgment that would attach to her prison commissary account any future wages and any assets she might ever acquire for the full $310,000 of the attempted fraud, plus my legal fees. The choice was not a choice. She signed the quitclaim from her cell in Danbury, witnessed by a prison notary, selling me her non-existent interest in the Lakeside Lodge for a single dollar bill. I mailed that dollar to the warden with a note that said, "Please credit to inmate Halsey's commissary, with my compliments." My father, after everything, couldn't look at the lodge without seeing Patricia's shadow. He told me the whole place smelled of failure and betrayal, and he didn't want to own anything that reminded him of the woman he had almost let destroy us. He transferred his entire 50% ownership to me via a simple interspousal transfer deed that cost $47 to record at the county clerk's office. That afternoon, standing in the great room with the stone fireplace and the honey pine floors, I became the sole owner of 7 acres of shoreline, of every hand-scraped floorboard I had bled into, of every triple-pane window and rebuilt rafter and fieldstone I had hauled up the mountain. I didn't celebrate with champagne. The victory wasn't sweet so much as it was surgically clean, like cauterizing a wound. I drove back to the lodge, unlocked the front door with the original brass key that had never been taken from me, and stood in the silence. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and cedar, and the afternoon light came through the windows and fell in long rectangles on the floor I had scraped on my knees. Over the next 3 months, I rehabilitated the one guest cabin that had suffered a roof leak while the property sat empty, replacing the drywall and re-insulating the crawl space. I repainted the trim, tested every plumbing fixture, and rebuilt the dock extension that had warped in the winter ice. But I knew, as the booking inquiries started to arrive, that I didn't want the lodge to become just another rental for fishing tourists who would tread the floors without knowing their history. The lodge deserved a purpose that honored my mother, a place where women could build something no one could take from them. So I converted it into a women's writing retreat called Clear Title, a name that made me smile every time I wrote it on a reservation confirmation. The retreat runs from May through October. The main lodge has 5 bedrooms, each named after a woman writer who wrote about justice: Hurston, Morrison, Sotomayor, Baldwin, and Didion. The 3 guest cabins are designated for solo writing residencies, each with a small desk positioned to face the lake through a wide window. The boathouse, the one I had stabilized on helical piles, I gutted and turned into a library reading room with glass garage doors that roll up to let the lake air in. The shelves stocked with books donated by the writers who have come through. Outside, I installed a fire pit ring of local Adirondack granite, wide and low, with split log benches around it. That fire pit is where the ritual happens. On the first summer solstice, after the quiet tidal judgment concluded, I was cleaning out a closet in the main lodge that still held some boxes from when Patricia had briefly moved a few things in, and I found a manila envelope with a stack of wedding photographs from her courthouse ceremony with my father. I opened it and flipped through the images. Patricia in a white pantsuit, my father in a blazer he looked uncomfortable in, Curtis in a stained tie, all standing on the courthouse steps with forced smiles that didn't reach their eyes. I looked at Patricia's face, the sharp avarice behind the lipstick, and I felt the same cold click of the lock cylinder, but this time it felt like release. At sunset that evening, with a dozen retreat writers gathered around the fire pit, their mugs of hard cider catching the last light, I walked to the flames with the stack of photos. I held up the first one, the one where Patricia is clutching my father's arm with fingers that look like talons, and I dropped it onto the coals. The gloss of the photo paper bubbled immediately, the emulsion turning brown and then black, and the paper curled into a spiral of ash that lifted in the heat and drifted toward the lake. I burned each photograph, one by one, until the fire had eaten all of them. The women watching were silent at first, and then one of them, a poet from Buffalo named Ellen, started laughing, a deep, free sound that bounced off the water and echoed back from the pines. Now, every summer solstice, I take out a fresh copy printed from the digital files I somehow retained, and I burn those photos all over again. It's not about erasing the past, it's about reminding myself, and everyone who gathers there, that we hold the fire. What my mother's note taught me is that chain of title is everything, not just in property law but in life. The people you allow to have a stake in your world, the signatures you accept on the deeds that build your existence, matter more than any lumber or lakeshore or copper pipe you can install. My father let a forger into our family, and I let a locked box sit unopened for years, but in the end, a single sheet of yellowed paper, a dead notary stamp, and the quiet competence of a bank compliance officer unraveled a scheme that had been designed to destroy me. I live now in the lodge I rebuilt, the only name on the deed, and every morning I walk down to the dock and watch the mist rise off Mirror Lake, knowing that no one can evict me from the life my mother helped me build, and no one can take what I have secured with my own 2 hands. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? I would like to hear your story in the comments below. If you believe that home isn't built with money but with integrity, hit subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story. I'll see you in the next one.